I'm Michael Quinn Patton. Suppose someone told you that ending poverty is within our reach. Would you believe it? Would you pay attention? Well, clearly that would depend upon who that person was. Certain people, a very small number, when they say something, I listen. When they write something, I read it. And one of those people is Lisbeth Schorr. She has been studying programs aimed at alleviating and ending poverty for a long and distinguished career. And she has just written that we now know how to end child poverty. It's been 9 months since she last wrote a blog. So it's worth paying attention to what this senior fellow at the Center for Study of Social Policy has to say. How has she now reached this conclusion? What evidence is there to support this? Because I can tell you from personal experience with Lisbeth that she takes evidence very, very seriously. So I'm going to tell you a bit about her and about her conclusions in a blog that she's written about we now know how to end child poverty. To refer you to that full blog, for it's very much worth a deep read. She has spent much of her career debunking the myth that nothing works. As a lecturer in social medicine and health policy at the Harvard Medical School, she documented innovative initiatives in community health centers and schools that work well for poor children and families in poverty. The result was a breakthrough book in 1988 on lessons of effective programs. I still use these lessons when I teach evaluation about how to extract lessons, about how to use evidence to generate lessons. It's an extraordinary book that remains timely, and the lessons remain timely. She was a part of the group in 1995 at the Aspen Institute that generated theory of change as a major way of making sense of anti-poverty programs. Carol Weiss, Lisbeth Schorr, together were there articulating the importance of both theory and evidence in understanding how the world works and how interventions to change the world works. In 2011, she updated her work on effective programs for strengthening families and neighborhoods throughout America. More recently, in the last decade, she has been working on a major initiative around generating broad-based, multiple forms of evidence in finding social interventions that work. And so when she says we've now figured it out, we now have the evidence for what works, it's worth paying attention because she pays attention to the evidence and has been a major part of efforts to increase the use of evidence in government policy making. So in this blog, which came out June 21st, she lays out the evidence for how to end child poverty in America. And what she describes is the history of moving from doing nothing into the War on Poverty programs in the 1960s and the programs ever since, to the work that came out of the pandemic in providing direct cash transfers to families in poverty, and indeed to families of all kinds. She recalls that on January 8, 1964, in his first State of the Union address, President Johnson called attention to, quote, the many Americans who live on the outskirts of hope. She reports being inspired by Johnson's declaration of, quote, an unconditional war on poverty in America, close quote, and that we would, quote, not only relieve the symptoms of poverty, but cure it, and above all, prevent it, close quote. She joined the Office of Economic Opportunity, which directed the War on Poverty. 60 years later, today 1 in 7 U.S. children, 14%, live in families with incomes below the poverty line. Poverty is the leading factor in a host of negative child outcomes. And Black, Hispanic, and American Indian, Alaska Native children are disproportionately represented among children living in poverty. And in her latest blog, she documents the current situation in considerable depth and concludes, we now know how to end child poverty. The hard evidence about what works, she writes, quote, we are dealing with interventions about which the researchers have provided solid proof of what works. Now there is relevant evidence, hard evidence, on a crucial point: how family income support can change outcomes for children growing up in poverty. The expanded child tax credit was signed into law on March 11, 2021, as part of the American Rescue Plan. The ECTC legislation provided a monthly child allowance to families that added up to annual sums of $3,000 for every child aged 6 to 17 and $3,600 for every child under age 6. There were no strings attached. It was just money. It could be used for childcare, food, clothes, for anything. It treated parents, even poor parents, as the experts on their family's finances. A quietly radical idea in American social policy, she writes. It promised to furnish millions of families with monthly funding and would significantly increase the chances that their children would grow up healthy, well-educated, and prepared for a productive adulthood. So how did it turn out? Well, more than 90% of the cash transfers went to food, utility, shelter, clothing, or education. 1.5 months after payments started to go out, data from the census showed that the number of parents who said their children didn't have enough to eat fell by more than 3 million. By September 2021, the income supplements cut child poverty by more than 25%, pulling 3.4 million children above the poverty line. Ezra Klein wrote in the New York Times, quote, it was a huge experiment. It was studied exhaustively, and we can now say this definitively. It worked. Lisbeth Schorr treats this as a revolution in social policy that didn't last. Although the expanded child tax credit was widely lauded and its powerful impact was rapidly documented, Congress allowed it to lapse abruptly in December 2021, casting nearly 10 million children back below the poverty line. She concludes, given the weight of the evidence, the support, and the experience we have gathered over the last 2 decades, ending child poverty in America is no longer an impossible dream. It is a realistic objective that all of us who care about America's future can be working toward every day. Why has the direct cash option been allowed to languish? Well, I'll address that, as Lisbeth Schorr did, in a separate video. For now, take a look at her full video, her full blog, that describes in depth the problem, the evidence, and the solution. It's an extraordinarily important, well-articulated, carefully documented, not to be missed blog.